kind of want to have an understanding of who's in the crowd. Do we have people who are students still here?
We have 3 millennials.
3 millennials.
Recent graduates.
Recent grads. Fantastic. Retired individuals? Anybody who's retired that's here? No? And then the rest of you are employed, working, paying taxes, I hope. So, perfect. Okay. So today's presentation is going to kind of give you an overview of the economics in Canada and in the Ontario and part of Quebec will be impacted because of this. As mentioned, the previous presenter, these are my opinions. They're not even CIBC Wood Gundy's opinion. I've got the research from CIBC and from other economists, but these are going to be my opinions and how I see the ongoing economic impacts to Canada. So I think that the lead up to that was very good. I think pessimism is where a key thing will come into play. 2018 was a challenging year. 2018 was a challenging year from the economics, but more importantly, the stock market. And we got hit pretty hard in Canada, down 11% on the TSX, not including dividends last year. So that was a bit of a challenge. When you look at the economics from a global perspective, it was oil prices that actually hurt us. And oil really impacted overall. I mentioned earlier the difference between what the price of oil on what's called WTI, Western Texas Intermediate. It's about $53 right now, $53, $54. We're getting $11 less here in Canada. So the pipelines are one piece of it. We are not taking it to market. So there is a drag, and there's a bit of an impact economically when it comes to those oil outputs, pipelines, and so forth. So there's some concerns here. 2019, the way that we can actually get away from extreme pessimism in 2019 will be first if we can see the price of oil go up. Now, I don't anticipate pipelines happening anytime this year. I don't. I think it probably, if anything, 2022, if we can actually get our act in gear in this country. And so, to avoid pessimism further in 2019, we would like to see the price of oil in Western Canada Select go up. We would also like to see the Bank of Canada be a bit more patient with their interest rate increases. So part of my presentation today will be about how it impacts the average person. We've got different groups of individuals here. I think I could talk about economics all day long, but when it comes down to it, what does it really mean for us as Canadians? When we look at interest rates, one thing that was mentioned earlier was the stock market is a leading indicator of what people see the economies to be. I also look at the bond market. The bond market is a very good indicator of where people feel the comfort of an economy. And in the bond market right now, the 10-year real return bonds out there. Real return bonds are basically bonds that are indexed to inflation. So as inflation goes up, so will the value of that bond. Right now, the bond market is pricing interest rates over the next 10 years to be the lowest since 1952 and 1962. So the market is telling us that there's not much inflation in the future. I think we're over-pessimistic on this number. I think if oil prices do go up and there's going to be other contributions to inflation, it's going to impact all of us here. So what does that really mean for the average person? If inflation goes up, that means you have less money in your pocket to spend on other things. That's an impact to you. And if it's severely underpriced and inflation does take off, then you're going to have more and more of your dollars being spent on the same goods you were buying last year. So you don't have additional other monies to spend on other goods, more importantly for savings as well. Now, as a retirement transition specialist, one of my jobs is to make sure our clients transition to retirement successfully and try to save money for that and so forth. Part of the concern is if they don't have enough money to save because of these issues such as inflation, we've got a problem. And so our concern with that is, what do we do going forward? One of the key things is inflation being fairly tied in the short term to the price of oil. Alberta, where I'm from, we like the price of oil going up because it helps us economically speaking. You speak to everybody else in the rest of the world, they generally don't like high oil prices because that means high gasoline prices. And that takes an impact on their pocketbook. And so you've probably seen the price of oil or gasoline here in Ottawa drop over the last little while. And that's an impact of what the price of gasoline's been doing globally, and that actually helps you longer term. You can spend more money. If you've got less cost going to gasoline costs to your car, you can now spend more money elsewhere. But I think there's a mispricing happening here. I think at some point in this year, we will see the price of oil pick up. We will see gasoline prices increase. We will see a difference in that impact, and that's going to cause less money in your pocket. You're going to spend money in the the gas tank, but there's going to be less money for you to spend on other things. So be aware of that as part of your cash flow for 2019, 2020, as you see more and more money being spent out. Now, there is some things happening in Alberta that are impacting gross domestic product in the country. What the Alberta government has done is they've cut back or curtailed some of the production. When you cut back on production, you are taking an impact to the economy here in Alberta. So gross domestic product, most likely for the fourth quarter, will be slower than what was anticipated. And if we start to see this output gap widen, what that will basically mean is we're going to start seeing a slowdown in the economic numbers, which may put the Bank of Canada at a pause, but we might see interest rates go up later on in the year. So here are my concerns with what's going to happen going forward, is if inflation is mispriced, if interest rates might go up later on in this year, and we see oil recover, we've got a cost, and a cost to your pocketbook, which means you have less to spend. And here are the people who I'm really concerned about nationally. There are a large group of Canadians whose spending matches their income. There's a large group of Canadians whose spending is higher than their income. And as you have third-party exterior type of forces on your pocketbook, it impacts even more at an exponential rate for these groups of individuals. And so if your income is close to your spending, be prepared of what happens in the near term. Interest rates go up, that means variable rate mortgages, lines of credits, car loans, credit cards. These types of impacts will happen to your pocketbook almost immediately. We've seen 5 interest rate increases in variable rate mortgages. At some point, it might be cheaper to have a fixed rate mortgage versus variable. Now, 50% of all mortgages are coming due for maturity in Canada over the next 3 years. That's going to be a pricing impact for many Canadians. We also have a stress test problem here. The government has introduced a stress test for qualification of mortgages, which means if you want a rate shock going from one bank to another, you have to re-qualify with the new rules. That's trying to slow down the housing market. I'll get into housing in a minute. So we have 3 different external forces. We've got interest rates going up, impacts your debt. We've got inflation going up potentially, or I think mispriced. And that impacts your pocketbook as you spend out there. And I went through your core in downtown, and we went to some restaurants with Winterlude and so forth, and you guys have busy restaurants. People are spending. And that cost is going to go up, so it'll impact the bottom line. So if you want to have the same standard of life that you had in the last 2 years, it's going to impact your pocketbook at some point. So interest rates, inflation, and then when you start seeing oil prices going up, it will impact at the pump. You're going to start seeing a bit of an impact. So how does this look for Canada overall? I think the Canadian economy is going to slow down, much like my colleague said. You're going to see 2019 being less than 2018 and so forth for 2020. You look underneath, you'll see where it says for Ontario. Ontario looks a bit slower in 2020. Where's that impact coming from? As my colleague basically said earlier, because of the impacts of trade war, because of the impacts of lack of innovation, Ontario will be impacted by that as well. So I see a slowdown happening. Not much of a difference this year, but next year I think that's what we're going to have. And this is a very close piece to get you what is recession-like. It can feel like a recession. It may not be an actual recession by economic standards, but it could feel like it. And I think it's going to impact outside of the Greater Toronto area more than inside the Greater Toronto area, because there's more insulation from financial spending in that city versus cities like Ontario, Ottawa, sorry. When it comes to employment, and more importantly, unemployment, We see unemployment rates going up in 2020 versus 2019 in Ontario. So from 5.3% this year to 5.8%. Again, part of it is because we're seeing some plants close down. Part of it is because we're seeing some jobs being moved or industries being moved out or being relocated to other provinces, more importantly other countries. And I think that's part of the problem. And that's going to impact us here. Where I think is going to really impact, and I'm not too concerned about Ottawa versus the peripheral GTA. The peripheral GTA that may lose some jobs, that will impact on the cities. Those towns that are collecting revenue from property taxes and so forth, that may impact. From a provincial perspective, as we lose jobs, it's going to hurt us from an income tax perspective, of collecting revenue. So I think that's a short-term issue. If that continues, my fear is you've got a government in place that has no problem cutting. And should they cut further, the two areas that I think they may start with for major cuts will be social programs and education. So healthcare and education. Those are the two areas which really hurts people when you look longer term. And so when that happens, for those who have young children or individuals who will be going into post-secondary education, I would not be surprised to see tuition costs go up in 2020, 2021 to impact that pocketbook, which means either larger loans with higher interest rates down the road or more money on your pocket. When it comes to housing starts, in Ontario, looking pretty good in 2018, and we're starting to see a slow decline. Part of the housing start issue, I think, is because of the stress tests that the government's put in, and because of capacity within certain areas. So housing starts Ontario-wide will be slowing down. So we can't rely on that industry to lead Ontario through to 2020. When it comes to Ottawa itself, we've seen a nice jump in the condo market, not so much in the residential market. The condo market has done very well for two reasons. One, affordability. Two, stress testing has allowed people to get into the market, but not at freestanding or residential homes, more on the condo side. We're seeing more development here in the city because of that. However, the pricing ranges for 2018, actually, according to the Ottawa Real Estate Board, showed that residential prices were up 5%, condo prices up over 3%. Good opportunities for the real estate market in this city, primarily because of government hiring and the increase in the opportunities in this city. It's kind of unique coming from Calgary where these numbers are actually negative. Okay, so we see the opposite of what you're seeing here in the city. So Alberta is being impacted on their housing numbers, and that's just a ramification because of where we are economically in Alberta, reliant on the oil industry, while here, not so much. Consumer Price Index, this is inflation. This is what I was referring to earlier. We see that it's fairly tame in 2019 in Canada. Ontario will be slightly higher. You won't notice the difference nationally speaking, but you'll see an uptick on both areas in 2020. This will impact your pocketbook. Prices are going to go up. I think key areas where you're going to see prices going up are going to be at the grocery store and at the restaurants. You're going to see that. I've already mentioned earlier about at the pump, but these are the parts that's going to impact you individually. And so again, my concern of those families whose spending matches their income or spending exceeds their income, this is going to marginalize you even more comparisons. And that's where I think my colleague was also talking about that there's this difference between the rich and the not so rich. It's happening in Canada as well. And if you look at I call them protest votes, what's happening in this province, what happened in Alberta with Notley, where to some degree Trudeau was a protest vote to Harper. You're going to see more and more of these types of pendulum shift, I believe, not only globally, but here in Canada, from going from globalization to populism. And my view on that is as you move that pendulum from globalization to populism, you touch socialism first. And that viewpoint is everybody should be given the equal opportunity, and then it gets into those views of populism. You're seeing that in industries. What we've seen in industries from populism have actually exploded into the market. It's very easy now to see some of these major industries, such as Amazon, who's destroyed retail businesses out there because the average person wants something, they want it now, and they want it delivered to their door. They also want to be able to go on their phone and request a ride from a total stranger off the internet to somewhere around wherever they want to go. And that has taken a major shock to the taxi industry. And so these disruptors is what we call them in our business, but this has happened for generations in the past and will continually happen for generations in the future. And I think what's happened is we've seen more and more people become separated from the top 1% and everybody else. And so you're seeing more innovation come from the bottom group to force democracy or democratic purchases of goods. And that causes lower prices in certain cases, but destroys a lot of businesses. We saw a lot of protest across this country with Uber. We didn't see the same protest with the bookstore when Amazon first came out. It didn't impact as many people because the library was always there. We're still getting our books for pretty much free. It impacted all this revenue for cities who were paying, who taxi cab drivers were paying thousands amongst thousands of dollars for a medallion to drive in the city, and then Uber comes along or Lyft comes along and just changes it all the time. This is the change that's happening not only here in Canada but globally, and this pendulum shift going from globalization to populism. People are being marginalized along the way, and they come back with innovation to give to everybody else. It's a very interesting time. It impacts our currency. It impacts our currency when you have this type of change. And unfortunately, Canada is called the petrodollar. The loonie is considered to be a petrodollar, very close to the price of oil. And so as we see oil moves up and down, you'll also see the pricing. We're pretty much where we are right now at this point in time in the currency versus the US dollar is where we're going to probably end off at the end of the year with a little bit of volatility, dependent purely on the US side. I think this is more of a US reaction than a Canadian proactive viewpoint. And so those of you who are planning on traveling or purchasing goods that come from the US, here's where I think an impact could happen on your bottom line, because that would be an impact. For business owners, I think for you doing trade with the US, currency is not going to be as big of a swing as it was in the previous 5 years. For the next couple of years, I think we're going to have smaller swings, so it'll be easier to predict how the business will go forward. From a credit perspective, when we look at some of these credit agencies, Moody's and Fitch and so forth, they've downgraded Ontario's credit rating. And so what basically happens when you have a downgrade, newer bonds in the future will be priced at a higher interest rate than what's available today. Although they've got a respectable credit rating in Ontario, it has been downgraded. And that's primarily because of spending cuts that the provincial government wants to do. Infrastructure spending will hit the bottom line. And I believe that 10% of its revenue is being put towards deficits. So that's a bit of a concern for us. Canada has a stable outlook for their credit rating. Few areas to watch out for in Canada. One is housing. I have a big problem with individual debt. And I think Canadians, generally speaking, have used the equity in their homes as ATMs. They've been taking money out of their equity in their home via a line of credit and have been spending that money, not investing it, not using it for business purposes to grow income, but literally spending it on items you cannot use again because you've already spent it. I've seen too many Canadians use their equity in their home to go on trips, to buy depreciating assets, to buy luxury items that don't have the same value the minute you take it off the shelf. And that's a common theme. Unfortunately, within our community, it is a big problem. Members of the Economic Planning Board will probably attest that there are many, many Canadians across this country who are experiencing high debt issues. It is not abnormal for our community to be seeing this. And so my concern is those individuals are going to be marginalized even more when we go through this restructuring of interest rates going up, inflation going up, and more importantly, when housing becomes even tougher. So that's my concern when it comes to individuals. So how does this look overall when it comes to the bond market, or where the bond market indicates? I think we're going to see that Canada and Ontario should be fine. No major issues in regards to interest rates of borrowing money. It's going to be fairly close to what the Canadian government gets because the credit rating is there, but I'm worried more about the individual. They're borrowing. And I think that's where the issues lie. I'm not going to show you, the next slide I'm going to show you is not going to be too optimistic. I think when we look at what's happening in the stock market, I think we're pretty much there. What we've made in the last 6 weeks in the stock market is pretty much where we're going to end off at the end of the year. So I don't see much upside potential at the end of the year. I see a lot of volatility. And where did that volatility come from? Well, when my colleague was talking about Trump and trade war and so forth, and there's a plan, as an economist, you think longer term. You don't think 8 months, 9 months down the road. You think longer term. So when he says a short-term pain for long-term gain, he is absolutely correct. When you look at the stock market, they react minute by minute over every tweet and over any speculation that this deal between China and US will not go through. Now, I'm optimistic about the deal will go through, and I agree with my colleague that at the end of the day, Trump wants this done. I believe Trump is a free trade guy too. I think he wants that open market. He just wants to make sure that US has their more than fair share. And I think there's a big change happening. I think there's a big change happening in the United States where they are no longer wanting to be the country of choice. And what I mean by that is by 2022, the US plans to be oil independent. There's no need for Canadian oil to go down south anymore. Yet we're worried about a pipeline to go south. The pipeline going through west and east to get abroad into Asian markets is where we need to focus on. But the Americans are going to be independent of oil. And you'll notice where they're pulling their troops out, in those places where they were dependent on oil. I would not be surprised within our next 10 to 20 years, they no longer want to be the currency reserve of the world. Now, who will take over and stuff, we can all sit here and speculate. Will it be China, Europe, or some other currency? But there's a lot of pressure on a country when they're the currency reserve of the world. And that changes how people look at the American economy. So there is a view, and there's a strong view out there, that the Americans no longer want to be the destination of choice. They would rather have that pressure given to somebody else. Which is why NATO has been on the table of a pullout. Which is why the World Trade Organization has been on the table to pull out of. And all these issues that the Americans are bringing up, this is not Trump. This is an American agenda that's being made. That American agenda will impact Canada. And it will impact Canadians. Because we are so dependent on the Americans. Not only dependent for trade, but for data as well. For example, this last, I call it the lockout of the Americans. The recent freeze of employees. And I'll give you my personal example. My kids wanted to get their Nexus cards renewed. We couldn't get it done because the workers were not working because of this lockout. I think there's an impact with this issue further because I believe that when we look at what the impact is going to be to Canadians, it's going to go beyond just goods and services. It's going to come up to data. During this lockout, the government of Canada could not announce how much trade was happening between the U.S. and Canada because they rely on U.S. data. We don't even have our own data for some of this stuff. It wasn't until recently that we even knew how much data people were buying of Canadian residential properties. We have no idea if foreigners are coming in and they're buying until recently. And that was anecdotal. I'll tell you right now, we can tell you, in my business, if foreigners are buying Canadian bonds, we know it instantaneously. Not in the residential real estate market. Not even in the commercial real estate market. You have to announce it, but there's no data being collected. So how do we know where the money or capital flow is coming from? We can blame certain countries. We can say Vancouver was going up because of Chinese money. We can say that. We don't have the exact data to prove that. Because we've been relying on other countries to give us that data. We haven't had it ourselves. So this is an impact going in the future. I think where we're shifting is to be, in a horse race, there's the guy who wins, and there's a third and fourth place. They call me also-rans. That's what I guess they call that. We're just going to be an average G7 nation that isn't going to do much. So So my concern again is that when we're just trucking along, it impacts the people who are marginalized in society. It hurts even more. And so my concern again, going back to those individuals whose spending matches their earning power, they're going to be